Got another lens review today. I'm going to look at the Sony 28mm F2.8 lens. This lens was originally designed by Minolta in the mid 1980s, updated around 2006, and it was finally discontinued in 2011. And it was reasonably affordable, around about the £200 mark. All of the specs and details are on the screen for you if you want to have a look. Very similar in appearance to the 50mm Minolta, which I looked at a few weeks ago. This has more of a satin finish on the case, and there are some cosmetic differences between this and the Minolta version. You have a smooth rubber strip on the underside, for example, and they've also made the focus ring that has a rubber on it instead of a plastic moulding, which the original Minolta lens had. It's exactly the same optical design, and you also get that built-in lens hood. Personally, I get on quite well with the lens hood because even though it's not as effective as a full-size hood, it does help a little bit depending on the angle that you're shooting and where the sun is. Looking on the underside, this has a metal mount, screw-driven lens, and I'm just turning the focus ring so you can see that slot moving around. That engages with the camera body for focus. There's just 5 contact pins on this. They didn't update it, but the information I have is that they did update the lens coatings. They certainly did on all the other lenses that they took over from Minolta that are exactly the same design. I can't really test that unless I have both lenses together, the original Minolta and this Sony version which I have myself. Size wise, it's still a very compact lens, a little bit taller than the 50mm f1.7, which you can see on the right of the screen, and a shot now showing you with the built-in hood extended. You are much more likely to find the Minolta version around second hand on eBay. This will give you a rough idea. You're looking at around about €80, possibly a little bit more. I paid around about 70 for this one. I think I got a bit lucky on the auction price. Now putting it on a full frame camera just to show you the focus speeds with this, and it's quite a fast lens. It's screw driven, so you do get some noise. The focus ring does rotate, so don't touch that, but the filter doesn't rotate, which is the most important part. So it's a nice compact lens. It will help keep the weight and size down even if you have a relatively large camera such as the A99, which I'm showing you here. But it's also quite a good fit for APS-C cameras. I've got an A57 which I sometimes use it on. Of course you're going to have a crop factor with an APS-C sensor, so bear that in mind. Onto the optical test now. Outside, 28mm wide open. You'll see there is some vignetting in the corners and we have moderate barrel distortion. It is sharp though in the middle, and probably around about 85 to 90% of the frame is sharp, except in the very corners where there's a little bit of blur, which isn't unexpected for a prime wide open. It does quite well though. Once you've stopped it down a little bit, f4, you'll see that vignetting drop off. The midsection sharpen up, and at f5.6 would be around about optimal, then to f8 where you'll see the best performance across the frame. Now I'm going to do a comparison with a Minolta 28 to 105. That's at f8, and I've set the 28mm to f5.6, and you can see that even though it isn't fully stopped down as much as the zoom lens, it is outperforming the Minolta, and this contrasts with some of the online reviews that I saw saying that it wasn't any improvement over a zoom lens. The 28 to 105 is quite a respectable zoom lens. It wouldn't surprise me that a prime lens does outperform it, particularly in the corners. This is at f5.6 again versus f8, so there are some advantages to a prime lens in the edges and the corners where the prime lens does better, and that is something that I would expect. It depends on the lens that you are using. Not unhappy with the Minolta, but if I open them both up to their maximum aperture in the middle, they're both decent. Slight edge to the 28mm f2.8 in terms of the resolution. It's very close though. Mid sections and in the corners, the prime lens is out resolving the zoom, although sometimes the differences aren't huge. But bear in mind we're wide open, so there's 2/3 of a stop difference between this 2.8 and 3.5. It's not a super fast prime lens, but it is an improvement, particularly if you're going to use it in low light, so that is something which might be a factor for you. I mean, it actually does pretty good at f2.8. When you go to f4, the midsections tighten up, although they're not quite there in the corners, down to f5.6 or f8, and that takes care of those. So performance is going to be better than any of the zoom lenses that I have tested, and I have about 5 or 6 which I've used. Perhaps I have a very good copy, but it's definitely outperforming the zoom lenses that I have tried, comparing it to the 28mm. Although a 28mm isn't necessarily an ideal choice for out of focus backgrounds, it does a pretty good job if you are reasonably close to your subject. This is on full frame. You will see that it manages to blur out the background quite nicely. Again, that's going to depend how close you are to the subject. With this vape box that I have here, I'm quite close to that, but you can see it's smashed out the background quite nicely, pretty smooth. There's a few instances where it's not as good as I might expect, for example if we're a bit further away, but generally I'd say that the quality of the blur and the rendering in the background is pretty good on this lens for a 28mm prime. Certainly very usable at f2.8 depending on what you're shooting. Obviously if you're doing a scenic shot or a landscape, you're going to want to stop the lens down, but happily no problems with the f2.8. Although this is a little bit edgier, it's still fairly decent regarding the quality of the blur. Here's a few test shots that I've done outside. This is a f6.3 and quite a distant shot, and you can see that the details are well resolved on this. Again, we're on a full frame camera, so you're going to want to stop it down a little bit if you need edge and corner performance. That certainly makes sense, but in a low light scenario I wouldn't have any problems opening this up to f2.8. The main thing for me is that across a good portion of the frame at the faster apertures, the lens does deliver decent performance across most of the frame, and that's what I'm looking for with any lens really. If it's a respectable performance and its maximum aperture, and once you stop it down you've got a lot of details, particularly in the middle areas. This is another shot that I shot wide open. The light was dropping, and you can see in the mid section where I focused, nice and sharp, good resolution and details. Once you go into the edges, we've got depth of field here as well because we're focusing a bit closer and not to infinity or further away. It's a respectable job. If you're in low light, it's not a super fast lens, but it is going to be useful. Towards the side of the frames, the chromatic aberration can be an issue with purple fringing. Once you stop the lens down, it tends to become much less of an issue. So what I've done here is just corrected that quickly, and it's fairly easy to remove. You won't often notice it if you've got the in-camera corrections on. Obviously on a full frame we're going to have a standard wide angle, and that is something which is going to be useful. 28mm is a popular focal length. Once you put it on a crop body, your field of view narrows down to around about 42mm equivalent. It's going to be possibly of interest if you have an APS-C body as well, because it's just a small lightweight lens, and the optical performance on a crop body that removes any of the vignetting or issues regarding the softness on the edges. Another quick test shot outside. I've gone down to f4 to give you an idea of the performance, and mid sections and across most of the frame it does a nice job. The chromatic aberration does pretty much clear up once you've stopped it down, so just drop it down a little bit more to f5.6 and you should get your corners pretty much sharp. Shooting into the sun flare can be a bit of an issue, so do watch that. It very much depends on the angle that you're shooting at. You can stop it down, you get some reasonably decent sun stars if you're into that look. As far as the optical performance on the 28mm prime goes, it does everything I'd expect of a prime at this price point. It's a very inexpensive second-hand purchase. For users who have a standard zoom lens, say an f3.5 or an f4, I think it's quite an interesting lens for those types of shooters because of the extra speed that you'll gain with this. But if you already have f2.8 zoom lenses, be it crop or a full frame body, then it's probably not going to appeal as much, unless of course you want to go for that small compact size.